Borders and boundaries have been a part of history for as long as there's been history. Living near a border on either side brings with it a whole host of unique challenges to the way you live your life. Border zones can be a place of great danger, but they can also be a source of pride and inspiration. The great George R.R. Martin, creator of the Game of Thrones universe, said that he was inspired to create the Game of Thrones universe in part by visiting Hadrian's Wall in the northern part of Britain and imagining what it must have been like for a Roman soldier who was on the edge of civilization, kind of the border of everything they knew, and those soldiers looking out over the wall into the abyss, basically. From the Roman perspective, anything on the other side of that wall was an otherness, something that they weren't familiar with and couldn't really comprehend. So if you're a Game of Thrones fan, presumably Martin used that concept to create the Night's Watch and the Wall and the Wildlings and the others and all of that stuff that's captured the imagination of millions of people. During the period where there was a division between communist East Germany and democratic West Germany, there was a place you could go near the border village of Kella called the Window. The Window was actually a tourist stop on the West German side, so it was a big parking lot where buses could come, and they had a bar, and you could go get a beer while you sit there and look down at the East German border village of Kella. In much the same way that the Night's Watch looks out across the border and wonders who the wildlings are and what they're doing, people from West Germany looked out at the border at people that they thought of as others. They were fascinated by who these people were, how these East Germans were different from them, how did they live their lives under the harsh communist regime. How is it possible that just a few decades ago we could identify as being the same people? And what would happen? How would life change? And how would my identity change if all of a sudden that border went away? A little bit of a brief history lesson is in order here, and I'll probably oversimplify this a little bit, but just a little bit of context before we start talking about what life was like in this East German village of Kella. So after World War II, what you had was the Soviet Union pretty much occupying most of East Germany, while the United States and other Allied powers occupied much of West Germany. In 1945, when the war was over, you had the Allied powers, mainly the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, trying to determine what to do with the spoils of war. So to the victor go the spoils. Germany was obviously pretty well destroyed across the board after the war, and the question was, how are we going to divide this up? How are we going to rebuild this if we are going to rebuild it? Germany would get split up into occupation zones, and eventually what you're going to end up with is a communist East Germany known as the German Democratic Republic, which was pretty much controlled by the Soviet Union, Russia. And on the other side, you had a West Germany known as the Federal Republic of Germany, nominally democratic and allied with the United States and Britain and France. So you have this Cold War, which was a ideological struggle between the different political and economic systems that you had in Western democracies, mainly the United States, and the Eastern Communist bloc of the Soviet Union. And if you listen to your history textbooks, that conflict goes from about 1945, the end of World War II, to somewhere around 1989, when the Berlin Wall falls, or maybe 1990, 1991, depending on who you ask. I'm not exactly sure how useful those specific dates are as far as when things begin and when things end. Some people say the Cold War is still going on, and there might be something to that argument, but that's beside the point, a conversation for another day. When the Berlin Wall fell in late 1989 and East Germany and several other Soviet republics began to crumble, access to East Germany became a lot easier. So people didn't have to sit at that window spot in the parking lot looking down and trying to wonder what these people are up to. Now all of a sudden people could go in to East Germany and, legally get a sense for just what the heck was going on. From December 1990 to August 1992, anthropologist and historian Daphne Berdahl went to go live in the East German town of Kella, which was right on the border between West Germany and East Germany. She was there on the ground floor with the people who were actually experiencing it, and she was there to witness the disintegration of the East German state and the way that this changed people's lives. She witnessed a change in people's sense of community and how much of that community that they shared with other people around them and how that got replaced in a more modern capitalist system. She witnessed the change in the economy from more of a barter system based on connections to more of a capitalist system based on consumer goods and money and profit, these types of things. She watched as the role of religion changed over time in just these 2 years, and she also witnessed how people's identities changed as a result of the reunification of Germany. So there was a lot of pressure and opportunity to start acting like West Germans and start, integrating as much as you can. But there was also a lot of resistance to that idea, wanting to keep their East German identity, at least from some people. So this interesting identity conflict when the wall fell is something that Daphne Berdahl was able to get in on the ground floor and analyze from the people who were actually going through it. I think it's important to pause here for a second and just take note of the different types of history that can be taught. So I think most of us are familiar with kind of a top-down historical approach where, for the most part, you look at the big trends as they occur over decades, maybe even hundreds of years. So most of us got the top-down perspective from the Cold War, which I kind of just went over at the beginning of the episode. Ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. It goes on for a couple decades. Eventually, the communist system collapses because it's inefficient and pretty terrible on its people. The United States wins, capitalism and democracy spread. Everybody is happy, and that's the end of the story. While I think that there might be some kernels of truth in that top-down story, to me it's much more interesting to look at history from a bottom-up perspective. So what that means is looking at it from the perspective of the actual people who were living through those changes that we talked about. When you look at things from a bottom-up perspective, you get a much more nuanced and interesting situation, at least from my perspective. As Daphne Berdahl explains in her book, Where the World Ended, anthropology is just the study of humans in their habitat interacting with each other. Berdahl lived in that East German village for about 2 years. She recorded every conversation she had. She witnessed people interacting with each other at home, in the political sphere, at church. She witnessed how people lived their lives, how they did their work, how they afforded the things that they bought, how they supported their children, and she kind of put it all together, and she wrote a book about it. It's called Where the World Ended. In addition to all of this, of course, what she's written has been supplemented by extensive research, particularly into the Soviet and East German archives that became open after the fall of the wall, party membership lists, interviews with the people of Kella, and so on and so forth. She looked at the extent to which people in this town and on this borderland maintained their traditions and their ways of doing things, and what things did they maintain, what things did they change as East Germany and West Germany became unified. How did they incorporate all of their traditions into this new political and economic system in order to form a new identity in some cases, or in many cases, maintain their own identity. Berdahl argues that despite that top-down approach that a lot of us have learned, when the border disappeared and when East Germany and West Germany were reunified, it wasn't like these people in East Germany just were suddenly and passively absorbed into a new nation and then began living their new life. It was a long and complicated process of trying to form a new identity. In addition to attempting to answer some of these complicated questions of identity, really the subject of this episode here is the insight that Daphne Berdahl gets into those two always controversial subjects that you're never supposed to bring up at your family Thanksgiving dinner: the politics of everyday life and religion. The first thing that you have to understand about living in Kella, an East German border town, is that this was a harsh communist regime that was in control of pretty much every aspect of everyday life. So after World War II, the people of Kella were going along their daily lives and going through their daily tasks when all of a sudden they noticed all of these refugees flooding in from the east. Presumably they were fleeing the Soviets. Here's how one villager put it, quote, "There was much unrest in the village. All at once many strangers appeared. Evacuees wanted to get over the border quickly, mothers to their children and children to their mothers. One could hear many a groan of exhaustion and see many anxious faces scurrying through the bushes." End quote. A few days after that, the Soviet soldiers showed up, announced that they were occupying the village and the surrounding area, and within a few days and weeks, you had a barbed wire fence, you had checkpoints, you had a border that wasn't going to be crossed between East Germany and West Germany. And keep in mind that Kella is a German village at this point, right at the end of World War II, and Germany just lost the most brutal and horrific war in the history of humankind. And many of the villagers, although they had no part in what the Nazi regime was doing, they were worried that these soldiers occupying the village could destroy it or do all sorts of horrible things, which wouldn't be that out of bounds from the perspective of all the atrocities that had been normalized during World War II. What's strange is that this village actually, before the Soviets occupied it, it was briefly occupied by American troops. And here's a account of a 13-year-old girl at the time who is actually fearful of the Americans. Here's what she said, quote, "We started to cry right when we saw the strange soldiers, because we all thought the village would be set on fire and ransacked. We also realized that we had lost the war." End quote. So this psychological torment that the border is causing for a lot of the villagers in Kella is something that's deep and ingrained and goes all the way back to the end of World War II. Now, eventually, U.S. troops would leave because this area was traded to the Soviets for different parts of Berlin. So the U.S. got a couple neighborhoods in Berlin, and the Soviet Union and the East German government got this area of Kella and the surrounding area. So they basically traded it like trading cards. It's amazing how lives can be affected for generations based on wheeling and dealing, where the people who actually lived there were probably just an afterthought. So once the Americans left, like we said, the Soviets come in and occupy it. And once they establish their bunkers and their fences and their checkpoints, Kella is now officially a border village in a socialist country. And of course, over time, people would settle into a new lifestyle that socialism required. People worked mostly in factories, either the state-owned cigar factory that was close by, or a state-owned toy factory, or on the regional collective farm. Most people had their own livestock to make sure the family had enough food and to keep up with the quota system where they were required to deliver goods and animal-produced products to the state. We'll get more into the economics of it in the next episode, but in this one I wanted to focus on what everyday life was kind of like from a political and a religious perspective. What needs to be understood is that when you live in a small village of about 600 people, and particularly when it's under the control of a pretty harsh communist regime, the senses can be a form of social control. So what I mean by that is that when you hear the sound of a car driving by, or when you hear the loudspeakers going off, or sirens, or your neighbors chatting, or the sound of footsteps coming to your door, in a communist society, this is always good information to know. The state was always lurking in the background, and the people in the village were never quite sure of their motives or the intentions of the state. Not only was it visible every single day with the barbed wire surrounding most people's yards and the Jeep patrols that went up and down the border and the surveillance that was going on from the police, but you also had to wonder about your neighbor. Almost half of citizens' arrests, if you believe the Soviet numbers, which you might have good reason to question, almost half of arrests that were made for insubordination or ideological issues were citizens' arrests, meaning that people were informed on by their comrades. Here's Daphne Berdahl talking about how deep the presence of the state was in the minds of the people of Kella. Quote, "The presence of state structures was so internalized by people living here, in fact, that a year after the wall fell, some people were still taking their feet off their automobile accelerators or reaching for their identity cards while approaching the site where a barrier and control point used to be." End quote. So the desire for secrecy and the fear of being caught was so ingrained in these people that they were reaching for ID cards at checkpoints a year after they no longer needed them. That's crazy. The state was constantly shrouded in secrecy and mystery, which gave it more power because the people in the village were never quite sure when the state would show up in their lives and how it would. So the best course of action, of course, is always to be cautious. In philosophy, there's something called Bentham's panopticon, and a lot of philosophers and intellectual types have thought about this hypothetical scenario where you have a prison, and there's one watchtower that overlooks the prison. The prisoners can't actually see into the watchtower, so they don't know whether they're being observed or not. many of these philosophers hypothesized that if the inmates can't really see the guards or the guardians, then you're more likely to behave as if they're constantly watching you, because that's the safest course of action. So it turns out when the state is kind of shrouded in this secrecy and this mystery, people are more likely to be fearful of it and kind of go along with what the state wants you to do. So how did the East German state kind of control things from the shadows? Well, one of the things they did was that they strongly discouraged religion. So we'll talk about this more in a second, but this region of Germany was a strongly Catholic region that had religious roots going all the way back even before the Protestant Reformation. So religion, and in this case Catholicism, was something that was incredibly ingrained in the culture and the traditions of the people. Religion was discouraged, and people were instead encouraged to join some of these socialist mass organizations that were controlled or heavily influenced by the state. Stuff like the Red Cross, the fire department, a women's federation, civil defense club, the People's Militia, so on and so forth. About half of the adult population was involved in these groups, which means that social life in Kella was tied directly to the state, which is important. Another way the state controlled things was through something that Daphne Berdahl calls a time tax. And a time tax was a display of state power and a show of control over the most valuable asset that people had personally. When you think about it, the most valuable asset you have, and really all you have, is time. It's one of the only things that you can't get back, and anything that you enjoy or you find productive or is going to help the people around you, you're going to have to spend time doing. If you don't have any time to do the things that you find valuable, then life's going to be a lot more difficult for you. As the great Craig Sager once said, time is simply how you live your life. Aside from being forced to spend time on contributing to the state-mandated quotas for food and materials, the state also organized weekend work brigades, quote-unquote voluntary border patrols, stuff like this, where people would have to spend a lot of their time investing in the state. And quite honestly, people spent a lot of time just simply worrying about, should I report other people? Are other people reporting on me? And as anyone who's kind of spent time like this worrying about things knows, over the course of time, it can have a really degenerative health effect. Daphne Berdahl tells a good story where she illustrates how there's this constant paranoia about state control, and sometimes that can even be a double-edged sword. So here she is, quote, "Many citizens reported activities out of fear or suspicion that the outsider was a Stasi, state security agent sent to test villagers' compliance. In one instance, I was told that a resident confronted a strange man walking back and forth so close to the border fence that the village figured he had to be an agent. On asking the man for identification, the villager discovered that he was Karl Edward von Schnitzler, host of the infamous television show The Black Channel, and for 30 years the GDR's leading anti-Western propagandist. Although this resident had done his duty, he was more concerned about what he had revealed by not recognizing the television host. Not only that he did not watch von Schnitzler's show, but also that he probably watched only Western television and might thus be subject to closer scrutiny." End quote. So this guy is worried that if he doesn't report somebody, he might be viewed as someone who isn't a good citizen. So he ends up reporting this guy, and it turns out to be one of the most famous people in the GDR. and it reveals that this person is not really on board with the communist ideology because he doesn't know who this famous TV and radio propagandist personality is. To me, that's a good story that kind of illustrates how people are always going to be paranoid, and even if you are trying to do your duty, it might not work out for you. In order to avoid situations like the one I just mentioned, people joined organizations that kind of made it seem like they were more a part of the state than maybe they really were. And of course, some people were actually into it and signed up as party members and so on and so forth. But it seems like most people join these organizations as kind of a lesser of two evils type thing. The idea was that if you signed up for the Civil Defense Club, or if you signed up for the Red Cross, or if you signed up for the Women's Federation, then perhaps you wouldn't have to do some of the other things that were seen as less enticing, like the People's Militia, or joining the border security, or getting drafted into the army. And isn't this a very relatable situation here? I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I've signed up to set the table at Thanksgiving so that I don't have to do the dishes later. That's kind of the idea from the perspective of a lot of these East German people. They were signing up into these organizations to kind of give themselves some street cred, some credibility with the state, so that when the time came for the less appealing jobs, they wouldn't have to do it. Here's an example backing that up from a citizen in the town of Kella. Quote, "Sometimes you had little choice about things. I was called into the factory office and asked to join the militia. When I said no, they said I'd have to join the reserves. I still refused, but a week later I received a notice drafting me into the reserves in Berlin. So I joined the militia in order to stay at home." End quote. This story and others like it illustrates what a lot of villagers call the difference between the quote-unquote Reds and the quote-unquote really Reds. So the Reds were the people in the village who joined different groups and maybe joined the party in order to get ahead in their careers, maybe because they felt they had to. Maybe they wanted to practice a hobby that was frowned upon by the state, but they felt that if they joined something, the state would be more lenient on them to allow them to do that. Maybe they wanted more freedoms and less eyes from the state looking at them. So the Reds are basically people who are just joining it for non-instrumental, practical reasons. And the really Reds are the people who actually believed in the system. Officials, informants, people who went to party demonstrations willingly. The Reds often still attended church, but sometimes felt animosity from people on both sides. The people who really resisted the state, who felt that church and religion was one way to resist. And they also felt animosity from the really Red people who obviously frowned upon going to church. So sometimes those people in the Red category were stuck in the middle. Here's the mayor of the village of Kella talking about going to church and how this made her feel very conflicted. So I would put her in that really Red category where she couldn't do it, but she felt bad about it. Quote, "I became mayor around 1980, and at the time there was this rule that every mayor had to be in the party and wasn't allowed to go to church. I thought, well, okay, I'll become mayor. That was certainly a wrong compromise, but I did have a few good intentions. I told myself I could help these people, these little people who are so often treated unjustly." End quote. So from a practical perspective, this woman is saying that, look, someone's going to be the mayor here. And if it's not me, it might be someone who's more unjust and isn't going to treat the people right. So it might be worth it to make that decision. And yeah, I won't be able to go to church anymore, which I'm going to feel bad about, but maybe I'll be able to help more people by joining up and becoming mayor. whether or not you agree with that assessment or think it's the right thing to do, you have to appreciate the complexity of the situation. Here she is talking about how she might regret what she did. This is, of course, an interview after the wall fell. Quote, "When I think about how hard I worked, how hard I fought for every little thing, how happy I was when I could help, and now to think that was all wrong, everything I did, for this village. I didn't necessarily want the communist system, but simply to help make life somewhat more bearable for the people here." End quote. This particular lady, the mayor of Kella, would eventually get more or less run out of the town once Germany became reunified. A lot of people blamed her for what was going on in the village, and a lot of people judged her for putting her commitment to the state in front of her commitment to the church, and they never really forgave her for that. And she went and lived the rest of her life, presumably with this deep psychological burden that this crazy situation put her in. And you feel bad for the everyday people who were taking part in this system, because you get the sense that most of the people in this village weren't hardliners. They were just everyday people looking to make the best of a situation that obviously wasn't ideal. It's pretty clear from looking at the way that villagers portrayed their life in the town that the state's control over the village was pretty total and pretty permeating throughout all the different elements of society. So we talked about how people were discouraged from going to church, and they were kind of forced into these situations where they had to join these state-run groups where presumably the state could keep tabs on them, and they were constantly worried about informing on people and being informed on. And there was this time tax where the state was kind of forcing people to spend time doing things the state's way. But there were opportunities for dissent in the system. There was a village council, and this council provided opportunities to submit legal complaints to the regime. Most complaints at meetings, according to Daphne Berdahl, usually were about a lack of materials, lack of consumer goods, lack of supplies, traveling, and specifically being denied travel rights, poor quality of food, or just general suggestions for the village. You could submit formal complaints about these things and requests, and the state would actually take it pretty seriously and then render a judgment. The problem was that in the eyes of the villagers, the people who lived in Kella, these judgments were almost arbitrary. And Daphne Berdahl argues that this arbitrary use of state power was important for actually maintaining the role of the state. Here's what she says, quote, "The state gave no reason for denying requests to travel west, thus forcing applicants to search for one. Had they not attended enough meetings? Should they have become involved in the village council? The seemingly arbitrary approval or denial of such requests, sometimes different decisions were rendered within the same immediate family, fostered resentment and suspicion among people in the village. What had someone else done to have his or her request approved? Suspicion was also raised when a resident was treated leniently on a crime he or she was known to have committed. A common example cited are cases when one person's driver's license was reinstated immediately, but another resident's was revoked for 2 years for the same crime." End quote. So what she's saying there is that when you made a request to the state, say, I want to have my driver's license reinstated, the state would just seemingly arbitrarily either allow it or deny it. So a brother might get accepted, whereas a sister might get rejected for seemingly no reason. But if you're in that position, if you're in the village of Kella, in the communist society, you might start kind of inventing reasons for why this might be the case. You might get suspicious. The paranoia might start to creep in. Hey, what's that person doing that I'm not doing? Is someone informing on me? Did I do something that the state would consider illegal? Is someone watching me? So you can kind of see how it's a tactic used by the state to maintain their authority. And over the course of time, that paranoia and that obsession with secrecy is going to be pretty effective for the state. It reminds me actually a little bit of a previous authoritarian regime, the Mongols. As the Mongols would go place to place conquering villages, they would seemingly arbitrarily decide, are we going to burn this village and kill everyone inside it, or are we going to spare the village and be lenient? There didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason behind why they made the decisions they did as to whether or not to spare a village. Maybe they did have a rhyme and reason, but to the people in the village down the road, it didn't seem like that. If the Mongols decided to destroy every single village, and you're the next village in the Mongols' path, what are you going to do when the Mongols show up? You're going to get ready to defend it because they've destroyed every other village and they're planning on destroying yours. So why would you not defend it? You're going to die anyway. And if the Mongols spared every village, it's kind of the same logic would apply. If you're the next village down the line, you know the Mongols are going to spare you. It would make the decision pretty easy to relax a little bit, or possibly even talk with other villages about possibly going somewhere else and building up a resistance and having a nice buffer. But if the Mongols are arbitrarily destroying villages and then saving villages, you never know what they're going to do. So this creates chaos. If you're the next village down the road, you might have a faction that wants to defend the village. You might have a faction that wants to leave. You might have a faction that wants to stay. You might have a faction that wants to negotiate because you're not sure what the heck the Mongols are doing. So it creates chaos and it creates fear. It's something the Mongols understood, and it's something that I think authoritarian regimes understand. The more fear you can put in the population, the more uncertainty, the more doubt, the more chaos, that's going to be effective from a ruling perspective. So you combine this sense of paranoia and the mystical and psychological edge that the state had on the people. You combine that with a couple rounds of deportations and arrests, moving people inward to better secure the border, quote unquote. And the people in Kella fell in line relatively quickly with the state so that they could keep living in their homes and protecting their families. Here's one citizen talking about why she fell in line with the state after one round of deportations early on in the 1950s. Quote, "That was the beginning, when people became quiet and thought, we'll take everything in stride so that we can stay here. This is why so many people participated in the system." End quote. Daphne Berdahl's argument here is that the state, yes, was menacing and threatening, and of course it was. You can look at the deportations or the jail sentences for trying to cross the border, but it also matters the way that people interpreted the state. So this aura of mystery and secrecy definitely had a big impact on the way people reacted in real life. And the way they were psychologically affected, in turn, gave the state more legitimacy. And it gave the state more people who were following along. Another example of this is every month or so, the mayor would file a report on the village and send it to the state. So the villagers didn't know what was in the report. And of course, if you're in that situation, you're going to think to yourself, man, they're sending a report to the state about me and my family. It better be, I better be in line here, and I better be doing good things, and I better not be upsetting the state too much, or else I might get deported or jailed or so on and so forth. So people would act, it kind of goes back to that Bentham's panopticon thing, where if you're not quite sure what's going on at the top, you want to act like you're falling in line because it's better to do that than to take the risk. So when these reports were unearthed after the fall of the Soviet Union, it turns out most of these reports were very simple things, just going over materials and stuff that the village had and quotas and things like this. And very, very little of it was any sort of reporting on people or informing to the state for any non-communists or anything like that. But in the people's minds, that's what this was all about, and it helps contribute to people falling in line with the state. If the state's power was pretty total, there weren't a lot of ways that the people in the village could dissent, but there were a couple. So you could simultaneously be publicly supportive and privately deceptive. An example would be, instead of hanging your GDR flag out the front door on holidays, you could hang it out the back door. You could not be particularly concerned when that flag blows away. You could watch Western television or listen to Western radio, which was probably frowned upon by the state, but it was difficult for them to keep that out and monitor that. You could keep tabs on your family or your friends in West Germany. A lot of times, like we said, you could actually see across the border, and people's families, when they got separated, when the border went up, people would have family on one side of the border and family on another side, and that would be obviously pretty horrible, but people on the western side would go to the window we talked about, that parking lot area where you could look down, and people on the east side would look through their windows up at their friends and family members. And you couldn't really wave because that would be seen as dissentful, but you could clean your windows in a waving motion or shake out a carpet or a shirt in a waving motion while looking to the west. So there were ways that you could dissent, but probably the biggest one and the one that had the most impact on the actual people was through religion. The Catholic tradition in Kella went back hundreds of years, and it was going to be very difficult for people to suddenly give that up, even if that's what the state wanted. The state made attempts to shut down churches and prevent certain things from happening, people from going to church from time to time, but eventually the state recognized that they weren't going to be able to keep people away from their church for long, and maybe giving people an outlet to dissent like religion would actually give them a chance to dissent in a way that wasn't particularly threatening to the state as a whole. So what the state started doing was they attempted to create ceremonies, whether it be marriages or baptisms or confirmations or whatever, to replace the religious ceremonies. So instead of sending your kid to First Holy Communion, you send him to the state secular communist communion ceremony. So religious identities and songs and traditions would be strongly discouraged, while participation in these socialist and statewide ceremonies would be encouraged. It seems that most people in Kella maintained their religious roots, and a lot of them argued that it wasn't necessarily because of any of the doctrine or beliefs, it was the sense of community that religion provided, and the opportunity for an outlet that wasn't one of these state-run groups. One citizen said, quote, "People aren't necessarily fanatical Catholics, but rather they hang on to the external frame that the Catholic Church has provided here for the last 400 years. If people remain true to the Church here, they didn't do it because of a particular confession of faith. Instead, I think they clung to the truth of this community." End quote. Again, it's a little bit of that bottom-up history that we're talking about. So instead of looking at the big picture of the policies and institutions of the Roman Catholic Church and how that was implemented on an everyday level, what you're doing is you're looking at history here and religion and how it worked from a bottom-up perspective, how the everyday people actually lived their lives and how religion connected to what they did on a day-to-day basis. Many people in the village actually talk about this distinction between kind of their community church and their version of religion versus the big picture version and the doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. A good example of this is the state actually wanted to tear down the chapel in Kella. They wanted to just rip it down to shreds, and that would be that. And the Roman Catholic hierarchy, the guys at the top of the food chain, actually were fine with this happening. They might not have been fine with it, but they were going to go along with it and allow it to happen. The people in Kella obviously protested, and they eventually won this protest because of one argument, that it would be bad optics for the German Democratic Republic, the state, because the West could now go to the window and go to the parking lot and look down and say, oh man, look at these horrible communists tearing down churches and ruining people's lives in plain view of the border. And the state government realized the truth of that argument, and they didn't want to look that bad to their Western counterparts. It's amazing how decisions that are important to people's lives are often made based on what's going to make me look good from a leadership perspective. In addition to providing a sense of community that many of the people in Kella certainly needed, religion was also a way to oppose the state. So you could do small-scale things like hanging a crucifix in your house or creating a religious memorial in your yard. These were ways to test the regime and resist. See what you can get away with. If you build that memorial and the state doesn't do anything for a couple weeks, maybe you build another one. And maybe that's kind of your way of resisting. Religious people in Kella were never imprisoned directly, but they were discriminated against when it came time for ration cards, travel permits, surveillance, things like this. So it could be risky for them, but many people did hang on to that religious tradition and sense of community anyway. After the wall fell and Germany was reunified, one of the first things the villagers in Kella did was build a cross right near the border. And they put some barbed wire from the border fence on top of the cross to symbolize the crown of thorns. And this became a metaphor for all the suffering that the border caused and the hope that it would bring something better in time. But according to Daphne Berdahl, since the reunification, there was a little bit of a decline in the religious appeal and religious influence. She has a couple different theories as to why this might be the case. One of them is the rise of consumerism in East Germany, which wasn't there before the reunification. Berdahl spoke with an East German priest, Catholic priest, talking about this consumerism angle. Quote, "Faith was once determined externally. Now this faith must be retained even though the external forces are gone. Right now it's like after the war, when starving people who were finally given food ate so much that they died." End quote. He's basically implying there that consumer goods and the sudden turn to a more capitalist style of economy is causing people to lose track of what he sees as more important. The priest in Kella, the leader of the parish, said that consumerism is more dangerous than communism. And the bishop from the area around Kella said, quote, "Advertisements promise happiness and joy. With the words buy your happiness, industries try to obstruct people's view of reality. On the path towards a total consumer society that consists solely of acquiring, using, and then throwing away, not only car wrecks, but also human wrecks are left behind. End quote. Very strong words from that particular bishop there. And from all three of those religious people, what you see is a comparison to the previous communist society versus the new capitalist society. And it seems like all three of them are implying that religion was actually healthier under the communist regime. Faith was healthier, people were more religious, there was a better sense of community, so on and so forth. And the reason this is the case is because of this new consumerism that's ruining everything. Maybe that's the case, but I think there's also the fact that there's no us versus them dynamic anymore. Once the very fate of religion wasn't in jeopardy anymore, it seems that people were able to relax a little bit more. So perhaps the donations lessened, attendance became less as well, people's participation and, in general, what seemed like a decrease in faith may have been going on because there was no longer a need for that intense sense of community. People now had the freedom to seek that community element elsewhere. Whether or not you think that's a good thing or not can be up for debate, but I think there is that factor of human nature where when something's in jeopardy, you cling to it a lot more than if it's not in jeopardy. I think we've established a little bit here what life was like from a political perspective and from a religious perspective in this East German town of Kella. And I think anyone would agree those are two important elements of a person's identity and the way they live their life. With the question of religion that we just talked about and some of the other issues that we'll get into more in part 2 of the series, you start to get a feel for the way that people's identities and the way they live their life changes as a result of this reunification of Germany. So what happens in all of these spheres of everyday life when all of a sudden your whole way of living is shifted and you're no longer an East German or a West German, you're just a German? How does that impact your thoughts on religion? How does it impact your political attitudes? How does it impact the way you interact with your neighbors? How does it interact with the way you think about the traditions and where you came from and how you view your East German heritage? I think all of these are interesting and important questions. And it's something that the villagers in Kella had to reckon with after reunification. It became a sort of sad ritual for the people of Kella where once the borders were opened, they would go up to that window spot that we talked about earlier in the episode. And they would sit there and they would actually look down on their own village of Kella and they would ponder who they were, who they are now, and who they would be in the future. One of the villagers said, quote, "One of the first things I did after the borders opened was go to the window. I looked for the exact spot where my Western relatives would have stood when they came to look at Kella. And when I found it, I couldn't fight back the tears." End quote. Here's another villager a couple years after the wall fell talking about his experience at the window. Quote, "I will always remember this impression. I looked through the binoculars and could see my son coming home, my wife outside the house. That was only 3 years ago. Here is where the world ended."